Evergreen on developing this research, and we're presenting it together today. So just briefly, for those of you who are less familiar with the Pembina Institute, we are a nonprofit think tank that works across Canada to promote clean energy solutions and a shift to a cleaner economy. In our different regions, we work on different subject areas, and in Ontario, we've been focused on both federal policy and on transportation and urban solutions, and that's the team out of which this research came. You may have seen some of our reports in the past. We've done a lot of work on supporting location efficient development, promoting the expansion of transit in Ontario, and more recently promoting the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from the freight sector as well. So for more information, you can always visit our website to check out our other publications.
And hi everyone, this is Michelle German from Evergreen. And just a quick overview, Evergreen is also a national non-for-profit organization. Our mission is to help cities to flourish. We've been around since 1991, and our approach to public policy and reports like this is really figuring out how we can address complex issues by engaging with multi-stakeholder groups to understand what solutions may be. So we manage a couple of groups around transit, housing, working in mid-sized cities and economic development out of the CityWorks team, which is where I sit in the organization. So the premise for this research actually came out of our work through a collaborative called Move the GTHA, which is a multi-stakeholder collective impact organization that's been around since 2011 with representatives from the private sector, public, other advocacy groups, governments from across different municipalities. And that group has been mostly focused on how we can advance investment in transit in the region. And through that work, which Pembina is part of as well, we noticed that there was a gap in knowledge around how things were going on the ground. You know, we noted that there's historic levels of investment in rapid transit across the Greater Golden Horseshoe and in Ontario. And with that investment means that many communities are getting light rail transit or bus rapid transit or new kinds of transit that they've never had before. So we were interested in how this infrastructure will, has been directly impacting the quality of life of communities, the success of growth policies. But essentially we wanted to know how it's going, what we're learning so far, and particularly of importance with the release of the new forthcoming review of the Metrolinx Regional Transportation Plan, what key learnings may be useful for other municipalities who are about to undertake similar projects. So our approach to research was we took a case study approach and decided to choose areas that were at different parts of their journey, and we wanted to speak to different members. So we spoke to transit team members, municipal land use planners, developers, community leaders, citizen-led groups and residents associations, business associations. So we did 24 interviews with stakeholder groups from those areas. And we really focused on two main themes. One was around what were approaches to public and stakeholder engagement, and the other was around what were approaches around land use planning. So around engagement, projects with some particular challenges associated with it, we wanted to understand what those challenges were and how they were being addressed. And with land use, we were interested in seeing if there was uptake of certain Planning Act tools and other approaches available to municipalities. So, for instance, density and height bonusing tools to regulate urban design, community improvement planning, etc. So it was very hard to narrow down, but we wanted representation from across state of advancement. So projects at the beginning, middle, and end or completion. We wanted different leadership and funding models, and we wanted to look outside of Toronto. So to really focus on communities that didn't already have rapid transit. In Hamilton, we looked at line B of proposed rapid transit network, which is an 11-kilometer LRT from McMaster University to the Eastgate Square. Yeah, and Ontario Confederation line. It was led by the City of Ottawa, and it was 12.5 kilometers of LRT with 2.5 tunnel. Waterloo region, which led a largely funded by the region of Waterloo. It's a staged approach. So the first was 19 kilometers of LRT and 16 kilometers of BRT, which would then be converted to LRT in stage 2. And then the Huron-Ontario, which was or is 20 kilometers LRT through Mississauga to Huron-Ontario Street and into Brampton. So the first theme was around public and stakeholder engagement. Now we noticed, this is sort of a simplification of the challenges that we heard when talking with people. So generally, there seemed to be a perceived lack of transparency from the public side. So, particularly when these programs or projects take a decade to build, and there's multiple points of input from communities, people often didn't understand where their feedback went into and how it impacted the projects. So, although the new rapid transit projects are in line with plans that have been, in place for many years, not everyone was aware of how they were changing over time or where their participation landed. The other thing, which, I think plays out a lot in the media, were reactive local councils. So we noticed that throughout all of the cases, engaging and equipping municipal councillors absolutely must be a key part in a project team's engagement efforts, especially, as these projects go through election cycles. It became really apparent of how important it is to engage and educate and arm local councillors with the information that they need to be champions or to just be aware. The impact of construction, sort of an obvious one. At bottom line is that construction can last a really long time, and corridors often involve local businesses. So we found that the challenges with engaging with businesses to mediate a lot of the issues that came up, everything from signage to thoroughfares to all sorts of things, was a challenge across all of the projects. And then the biggest one, I would say, was really the fear of the unknown. So working in communities where they didn't already have a culture of ridership or an understanding of what transit actually feels like and looks like and is integrated into their lives seemed to be a very big thing to overcome. So on the flip side, we saw a lot of success factors around public engagement. So, on the screen now are just 7 overarching themes that we saw, and I can just go through a couple of examples to illustrate them. And these are all detailed more in the report. So the first one is really engaging early and engaging well. We saw different types of engagement and relationships for different stakeholders depending on their level of interest, influence, and time. We found the best way to determine how groups and individuals wish to participate was to ask them. So for the project leads to really be out and about. One of the best examples we saw was Hamilton's Community Connectors program, which really took a boots on the ground approach. Project team members make twice yearly visits to businesses and residents along the proposed LRT corridor to provide project information, help identify and respond to specific concerns. In one case, a building owner had concerns about impacts to the building's loading bay, and the project team met with the owner to explore a design solution. Metrolinx, we know, is looking to expand the Community Connectors program to other projects, and based on how we heard this went in Hamilton, we think that would be a great thing. So a couple of the other success factors was really looking at the big picture. So communicating how the project will help to achieve a larger vision around city building, explaining the project history, and using visuals. So in Mississauga, the actual LRT car has been set up outside of City Hall. And we heard that this was really effective in engaging and educating people who are actually a lot harder to engage with. You know, there's always the likely folks who come to public meetings, but how do you reach people who aren't going to come to those on a Tuesday night? So just having things like the LRT at festivals or in a public space like this, we heard to be very effective in answering questions and just sort of being present in people's lives. Keeping it honest and visible, you know, we heard a lot about building relationships with media, using social media and getting, you know, messages out there about what's going on, when there are challenges, to sort of just be in front of them and be forthcoming with information and reasons for decisions. So it's not necessarily, we didn't hear that you needed to make everyone happy, and we all know as people in the sector that you can't do that, but to be really clear and open and transparent about what's going on and why. The City of Ottawa has a policy to create an As We Heard It report after each public consultation. So we found this to be a best practice. These reports contain a summary of feedback as well as verbatim remarks from participants and pictures of sketches and maps created at the meeting. So things like this, where people saw themselves reflected and understood how the process and decision making was happening, was reported to be quite effective. I'm going to, I'm just aware of time, so we have planned for construction impacts, and really there it was meeting with all of the stakeholders and problem solving. Region of Waterloo, for instance, they offered funding for business support to BIAs to develop strategies that made sense for them. So made in, you know, local solutions to whatever the problems are, and allotting resources for whoever is having a challenge to actually make a solution for themselves. We saw this worked really well in the region of Waterloo, and it's worth noting that York Region has a very interesting business support program incorporated into each of their BRT Rapid Way projects. We didn't look at York Region as a case study, but we did a lot of learning along the way, and found that they were leading in a lot of really interesting ways around their BRT. The next best practice was really around embracing conflicts. I mean, you know, just thinking through what the challenges were, it's obvious that, you know, there's going to be a lot of conflict along the way over these long-term projects. A really great example we saw in Ottawa was there was a disagreement between the National Capital Commission and the City of Ottawa on the proposed LRT route. And they reached an impasse where it felt like they would be unable to resolve the conflict. But instead, they just sort of leaned into it, and they mutually agreed on a solution that involved tunneling part of the LRT. Participants in the working group attribute the group's success in part to having representatives at the table who both had decision-making power as well as people on the ground who are actually implementing. So that right mix of being able to sign off on things and move forward with them pretty swiftly was reported to be great. And encouraging local leadership. You know, this is huge. This is, you know, how we can respond to the divisive local councillors. Local groups, both formal and informal, really play a key role in filling knowledge gaps and adding to the discourse. We saw this in many of the case studies through chambers of commerce and other local groups. And, you know, working with city councillors to really arm them with the knowledge. One example we saw, we loved, was by the Waterloo Region staff of the ION story. It was a publication they put out which provides a historical narrative of the project from its earliest stages, and it was particularly useful during a municipal election period for informing candidates and new elected officials of where the project has come from, where it is now, and where it's going. And it really helped to demystify. And so when people were just coming into office, they had a sense of the story and of the challenges, and the transparency through that report seemed to be quite effective in keeping everything on track. At this point, I'm going to hand it off to Lindsay to take you through our theme around land use planning.
Awesome, thanks, Michelle. And this is kind of the second and final chunk of the presentation. In this part, we kind of took a similar approach, so identifying challenges and then best practices for responding to challenges, but more around the challenge of developing transit supportive land use along these corridors where new rapid transit was coming in. So to speak to some of the overarching themes that we heard around the challenges, one was that planning frameworks are increasingly complex. And what we mean by this is that municipalities are expected more and more to take into consideration not only a transit project, so not only how they're moving people, but the land use around it, the infrastructure around it, the active transportation networks, and thinking about how all these things fit together. And while of course we all benefit from a more integrated approach, it also becomes very complex quite quickly, not only internally, but also for members of the public who are trying to participate in these processes. Transportation and land use processes are not connected. So what we mean by that is that the way it turns out is that it's usually a different team leading the planning and design and implementation of the transit project, and then a different set of folks who are doing updating the land use regulations. And this is usually an inevitable situation, but it again results in a situation where sometimes you can have these teams not speaking to each other as much as they could be, or for members of the public, there's kind of two separate streams of ways to participate in a project, which from the outside might look like kind of one thing. And so to the extent that we can make sure that there are bridges being built between these two different parallel processes, we found that that was something that was quite important. It's a new challenge, so as we've said before, each of the communities we looked at, rapid transit was pretty new in those places. And finally, infrastructure isn't up to snuff. And so, of course, municipalities will often try to take advantage of these infrastructure transit projects to replace underground infrastructure, but different challenges can arise with that. That can make the construction period longer, and other sometimes surprising things can come up. So in one example, a municipality had found that although their water supply was sufficient to support increased population along the corridor, the water pressure wasn't enough to support high rise. And so these different things that arise that mean we have to be really thinking about the infrastructure piece as well. So in response to that, we identified 3 success factors around the transit supportive land use planning. The first is to establish clear processes. So as I mentioned, really make every effort to reduce complexity. One example of this that we saw was that the city of Kitchener in their land use station area plans decided to actually go through an EA process, and that reflected the fact that it really ended up being much more of a master planning process, and they had a sort of reliable, predictable series of steps to take when they decided to embark on an EA. Working with developers and landowners is a really, really crucial one, and of course that wouldn't be surprising to any of you on the line, but we saw project teams taking really innovative approaches to bringing in developers and landowners early on in the process and benefiting from this as a way to test different policies, even getting information around where lot consolidation or new roads might be possible. So this was something that was really valuable. And finally, making it about the neighborhood. And what we saw here is that, there are different ways to talk about land use planning, and where it tended to be framed more around density and transit-oriented development, it could be received in a way that made it more challenging. Whereas when we acknowledge the fact that transit-supportive land use planning is really about bringing new investment, new amenities to a community and shaping it in a way that's appropriate in the local context and appropriate in that neighborhood. That was something that was both useful as a way to talk about it with the public, but also useful as a frame of mind internally for how we go about these things. So in the last few slides, I'd just like to highlight a few of the really interesting land use planning tools that we found in the 4 different case studies. We go into much more detail in the report, so I invite you to take a look at that. The City of Ottawa and then the region of Waterloo were particularly interesting just because those projects are a little bit further along. So there was really a lot to learn from these cases. In the City of Ottawa, they first embarked in a series of transit-oriented development plans around each of their station areas of stage 1. And now they're moving into stage 2, and they're taking a similar approach, but they're actually, speaking to my point earlier about making it about the neighborhood, they're actually talking about these plans more as neighborhood studies and neighborhood plans. And that series of plans is going to be a bit different for them as well, because stage 2 takes place much more in stable neighborhoods in Ottawa, whereas stage 1 was more downtown and using a lot of the existing rapid ways. So really a different series of challenges there. Another challenge that's unique to Ottawa is that they don't operate in the context we have here in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, where there's a growth plan in place. So the City of Ottawa really had to grapple with coming up with their own density targets and ways of sort of back calculating the kind of heights and densities that they wanted to see along their rapid transit corridor. Part of this was another really interesting technique that they came up with, which was to use a flexible zoning change process. So once they had done the planning and come up with the new zoning designation for the transit corridor, there was a concern that the types of heights and densities that they were aiming for might not be supported by the market at first. And so they came up with a solution where existing landowners could redevelop under the previous zoning if they wished, but then had access to bump up to that new zoning over time. And so this was a way of sort of managing some of the uncertainties in the market. And it's pretty early days, but we're looking forward to kind of seeing how that pans out in Ottawa over the next little bit. And then I mentioned a series of guidelines that the City of Ottawa developed as well. And we really saw urban design guidelines as something that a lot of municipalities are using to get more into the details of how development can look along transit corridors. So in the region of Waterloo, I should say we looked at what was happening at the region level, and we looked at what was happening in the city of Kitchener, but we didn't have the capacity to look at the cities of Waterloo or Cambridge, who are also affected by the project. One of the really interesting things we found in this region was the region's community building strategy, which was published in 2013. This was a document that sort of talked about the vision of what this rapid transit project could do for the community beyond just moving people. So talking about the kinds of investment and the kinds of development that it could bring. And we found that this was a really useful tool for communicating the investment opportunities to the private sector, and then also for the local municipalities in using some of the market information that was included in that. And then, so the region's planning kind of built the foundation for planning at the municipal levels. We looked into what's being done in Kitchener on the planning around rapid transit stations studies. So these are a series of studies that will ultimately result in a secondary plan and new zoning around the new rapid transit stations. And finally, another theme that we found across a lot of the communities actually was a concern where these projects run through more stable neighborhoods of how they're also going to preserve the character that was there. And so the City of Kitchener's residential intensification and established neighborhood study was an example of a municipal response to this concern, and what will come out of that will guide the planning on the corridor as well. In the City of Hamilton, one thing that we found to be interesting was their use of an interim control bylaw. So their initial zoning dated from, I believe, the 1950s, and so really wasn't considered to be transit supportive. And so they used this tool to have that freeze for 1 year where they could do their studies and figure out what kind of zoning designation they needed for their corridor. They're doing downtown secondary planning and station area secondary planning. And again, using guidelines as ways also to shape development. The new zoning that was brought in Hamilton was quite interesting, and because they're kind of thinking about rapid transit for the first time, had some things that hadn't been done before. So there were requirements for built form and integration with the neighborhood, special provisions around stations, minimum heights of 3 stories in most places, maximum parking for cars, and then minimum bike parking. And finally, in the cities of Mississauga and Brampton, one tool that we found to be interesting was the Huron-Ontario Main Street Master Plan. This was jointly conducted by the 2 cities, and it really set out really identified the corridor as the logical place for infrastructure investment and intensification moving forward, and then trickled down into these more local tools that we saw developed as well. So to summarize on the land use planning piece, I think the overarching theme that we saw is that municipalities are using many of the tools that are available to them, but they're using the ones that make sense in their own context. And this looks different from municipality to municipality, and also looks different at different areas along these corridors that really go through quite diverse urban areas as you go along. So just to conclude, and then we'll open it up for questions, a few key findings that we were able to pull out of this research. One is that what we found in our conversations is that there is broad level buy-in around the importance of building transit. And although we hear a lot about the concerns and conflicts that arise, those things are, first of all, they're normal. They're part of folks being concerned about their communities and wanting to participate in shaping their future. And secondly, they tended to be rooted more in the process and priorities through the transit planning process and less in questioning the merits of building transit itself. In response to these, we really did see that project teams and municipalities are taking great strides, both on the engagement side and the land use planning side, and using the tools and approaches that make sense in their own context. And then finally, that relationships really do underpin the success of the project. And what we anticipate is that as we're going through these growing pains, networks and relationships are being built that are going to serve us well in future projects, and also that the lessons that are emerging from these projects can be used in other communities across the region and across the province. Great, so thanks for tuning in. We've put up some discussion questions to kind of spur your thinking, and we hope that you'll use the chat function to send us some questions for the next half hour or so.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay and Michelle. And before we get into the questions, I'll just flag that we will be sending the recording of the webinar and the PowerPoint slides early next week, so you can look out for an email from Lindsay with those. And I've added a link to the report for your reference as well in the chat function there. Yeah, so please feel free to send any questions our way. We got a couple during the presentation. So Lindsay and Michelle, if you're ready, we can start with some. So one question that we got was, so now what are the next steps? Like, what can governments or municipalities do with the findings of this report? Like, where would you like to see it go from here?
Sure, I'll start, and then Michelle, you can kick in if you'd like. I think there are a number of things we can take away from this. One of them, and it's a bit of a more specific finding, is to really plan a budget for engagement and business support. So we saw a lot of best practices that were happening, but what we know is that normally funding for programs like the Community Connectors program isn't always considered when we think about the cost of planning and designing a project. And so if we can start to take these into account from the beginning, then we can ensure that those kinds of supports are in place. Another key takeaway, I think, for local governments is really the need to equip local leaders. And so this means providing information and really engaging with those people that can be spokespeople for the project in the community, and also the ones that are on the front lines of receiving questions and concerns. So that involves municipal councillors, leaders of chambers of commerce, leaders of citizen groups, residents associations, etc. And then finally, I would say thinking about conflict as something that we need to embrace. And so again, I think it's normal that these infrastructure projects bring challenges. We're living in an era where the public expects a level of engagement and transparency that perhaps we didn't before. And so we need to just be ready for this and ready to have the difficult conversations that will help us build the relationships we need to move forward.
Great. Okay, so the next question we got was Hamilton the only of the 4 case studies where parking requirements were addressed? And can you discuss how parking was addressed?
Yeah, great question. That was not the only community where parking was addressed. I know that most of the other communities that had completed their zoning bylaw update along the corridor took parking into consideration in some way. It looked different in different places. So whereas in Hamilton, there was sort of a max car parking, minimum bike parking requirement, that looked a little bit different across some of the other case studies. And parking was also taken into consideration also as a development opportunity. So in some of the other corridors, there were large existing parking lots, and there was kind of a separate effort to consider how those spaces could be regulated and then brought in as really great opportunities for building out transit-oriented development.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. All right, so the next question we have is about first mile, last mile planning. So is there any evidence in the case studies about first mile, last mile planning, and what are there plans to get people to stops, like to get people from stops and then stops to work or school, like kind of any like micro transit, things like that?
Yeah, so great question. We definitely saw that, thinking about the neighborhood plans, we found that communities who talked about the transit infrastructure in broader terms got to things like first and last mile and active transportation. So I think we saw that definitely in Waterloo, and we also saw that conversation come up a lot in Hamilton about how people from different parts of the city were going to connect to where the stops are and where the lines are. But it certainly felt that that conversation was enabled by putting the transit infrastructure in a broader context and then letting the community lead what they needed to see in order for this project to work.
Yeah, I would add too, I think we would have seen even more of that had we dropped into projects that were even further ahead. So I know the conversation we had with Waterloo Region, they had really started engaging existing transit riders as a way to start talking about how to connect the whole system together. And that's something I think that will follow more sort of after these initial phases of transit planning and then the land use piece.
Great. Okay, so the next question we have goes back to the engagement piece at the start. So could you elaborate more on the fear of the transit unknown challenge? So often when we think of unknown, when we think of fear of the unknown, we think of how the construction will go and what the street will be like afterwards. So did you guys find a different meaning of, fear of the unknown in your report?
I think to speak to the theme more broadly, I think change is difficult anytime in any community. And so when we talk about fear of the unknown, to me that was synonymous with sort of the difficulty of change. And when we don't have something to point to see what the future might look like, it can feel scarier. So some examples we saw of sort of being able to address this fear of the unknown were municipalities kind of organizing delegations to go see LRT projects underway in other communities. So I know that the region of Waterloo hosted a number of these visits, and these were ways for local councillors and decision makers to see what it might look like and be able to communicate that back to their constituencies. So that was one way we saw that was, addressed.
Yeah, and just to speak to what we meant, because really what we did is we themed out what we heard over all of the different stakeholder interviews, and time again, it really felt that we heard things like, and people got mad because they didn't know about the construction or the change, or a stop changed from here to there, or a timeline shifted or something like that. And I think, people's fears of the unknown really came through throughout all the different stakeholder groups of, what does this mean to me? What does this mean to my life, whether it's my livelihood or my business or my safety? And so I realize that this is kind of it's an esoteric area of exploration, but, giving people concrete examples, like marking where sites are, using art, engaging people with how their community is going to change and showing them, letting them touch and feel, seemed to be the easiest way to combat that. But again, it's sort of compiled with the embracing conflict piece, that people are going to be uncomfortable and we just kind of have to lean into that. But we found that in all of the interviews and all of the conversations, somebody inevitably would bring up so-and-so, or I was uncomfortable or worried about this thing. And often we wondered, how could that be addressed in all of these projects?
Great, thanks, Michelle. So the next question is, we often face a lot of pushback from people saying that they won't ride transit, and there's a lot of anger over lost parking spaces and lanes for car traffic. Did you find any good examples of car-centric studies that changed people's behavior as a result of rapid transit?
I don't think this is going to quite answer the question, but with respect to the sort of doubt that folks will actually ride the rapid transit project, that's something that we heard about a lot. And when we start bringing forth ridership projections, I think sometimes the debate can get kind of pigeonholed into something that kind of misses the big picture. And one response that we heard actually from a local councillor in Mississauga, who was really quite a leader in bringing along his local constituents and stakeholders in the conversation, was really to be able to say, here is the growth that we anticipate in our community, and it's massive, and look around us, we're already seeing the evidence of this growth. And it's not so much we have a choice as to whether or not to build transit and complete communities. It's kind of a question of how, because this population growth is going to happen. And from what he shared with us, he found that way of carrying out that conversation was something that tended to resonate with people, especially in these communities who really are seeing the impacts of growth in all kinds of economic and physical ways. So to directly answer the question, I didn't see any specific car-centric studies. That doesn't mean they're not out there. But in terms of kind of responding to those doubts around the sort of viability of the project, that's a interesting approach, I think, that we found.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. So the next question is about the recently updated and released growth plan. So is there anything in the new growth plan that either of you saw that you think would either help or hurt transit planning moving forward?
Great question. I think there's a lot that will help, and I was struck when I was reading through the new growth plan, the number of themes that made me think back actually to this report. One of them is the sort of that a lot of the wording around integrating infrastructure planning into land use planning was brought into the growth plan in a stronger way. And as I mentioned in the presentation, this is something that we found was really important and taking on the complex task of thinking through infrastructure, transit, and land use all together. And then secondly, there's also stronger wording around the extent to which transit should be a priority in our communities, as well as the formalized density targets for those corridors and nodes. So on all those aspects, I think the growth plan, some of the new changes in the growth plan really respond to and resonate with some of the findings we had in this report.
Yeah, and I think in terms of what tools it's presenting, it seemed to me that there's a big opportunity for demystifying what the growth is in the region. I mean, my understanding is that we're expecting to see about 100,000 people move to our region over every year for the next 30 years. And the new growth plan, breaking that into what our density targets should be, and then how we translate that with these projects, I think will help us connect what actually needs to be done. As Lindsay said, it's not, do we need to build this? It's how, and compiling the transit with the other components of amenities, walkable communities, and housing. I think the growth plan really ties it together, which as an approach of pointing to the larger picture, I think the growth plan enables that conversation and those connections.
Great. Thank you. So the next question is, did you research or identify any best practices related to community benefits agreements?
So that wasn't really in the scope of the research that we did. I mean, it's absolutely an important theme and emerging field. Some other work that I've done around community benefits through Evergreen has been also looking at best practices of doing those agreements in tower renewal communities. So I can speak a little bit to those best practices, and they're actually quite similar in the need to involve you know, the local community and the local stakeholders. So when we say community, we mean everyone involved, not just residents, and visioning out what the needs are, what an agreement would be, what the benefits should be. So we didn't look at it here, but I would say that it's an absolutely huge opportunity to embed community benefit agreements in all of these infrastructures so that we're leveraging every dollar that we're investing in infrastructure to get multiple benefits and supporting our economic development in our communities. So it's a thread that I'd love to do some more work on, but we didn't focus here.
Yeah, totally. And while we didn't focus in on any major CBAs, we did hear from some of the municipalities that they were considering how they could use Section 37 within these corridors. So that was something that came up, and it wasn't kind of fully fleshed out yet. But I do think that Section 37 provisions are something that folks are thinking about as
well. Great. Next question is, any examples of how to best address consultation fatigue? So often like transit operators, provincial bodies, regional bodies are engaging the same community. Yeah, so did you come across any examples of how to address that?
So I want to go back to embedding it in the larger picture. I mean, when we're talking about building new infrastructure right now, and I think this is probably true across Canada, is we're building all sorts of new infrastructure. So it's not just transit, it's housing, it's new amenities, it's new waterways. So I think acknowledging the silos that often happen in government between different projects and bringing together a coordination of the projects through the consultation is an approach that I think everyone should be considering. And we certainly saw that when neighborhoods were talking about their plans, because they weren't necessarily just focused on transit, and they were able to embed it in a larger plan. So I think the onus might be on the organizers to reach out and figure out what else is going on and what's being built in their communities and start to draw these conversations together.
Sorry, yeah, and one kind of tangible example of that we saw in Ottawa was they have a kind of an online portal that has all of the different public consultations that are happening in the city, and they're actually divided by neighborhood. So rather than being divided by project, you can say, I live here, I work here, and I'm concerned about this area, and kind of see all the different initiatives that are happening there. And we thought that was an interesting response to the issue that many things are happening at once. And the other thing that we saw across, I think, all of the case studies was offering different modes of participation. And so another way to respond to fatigue is to offer sort of higher and lower investment ways of participating. So if someone can attend a public meeting for a project that they are really concerned about and then do a quick online survey for one that might not be as important to them, that's another way to kind of be able to balance the efforts of the public.
Great. So the next question is, can you explain or give an overview of what's in a transit-oriented development urban design guideline, and is it different than a regular urban design guideline?
Great question. I would have to look back because it's been a while since I actually looked at the TOD urban design guideline that we mentioned, but my instinct is to say no, and that it was actually an urban design guideline that was specific to the transit corridors in that community. So beyond that, I mean, it would mean that the guidelines themselves were encouraging things that are transit supportive, so certain heights and densities, certain integration with active transportation, but I don't believe that functionally it works any differently than regular old urban design guidelines.
Great. I love the term regular old urban design guidelines. It's a very planner niche audience here. I love it. So the next question is about communications. So what were some of the lessons and best practices in terms of, outreach in communications and language? So most stakeholders obviously cannot read a 200-page planning report, dig into bylaws, things like that. So how did you find best practices and address those things and, to get interest and to build trust with stakeholders?
Very good question. I think the best practice we saw was arming people at the front lines with information. So arming counselors, arming heads of residents associations, community leaders, so that the answers are actually being given and shaped and championed by people's neighbors, cousins, moms, friends, colleagues, rather than out of a report. I think reports and shiny documents are really great to help, the project leads shape what those messages should be. And I think across the board, we saw some really interesting reports that came out. But what was actually useful is taking those reports and sharing them with people proactively. So knocking on doors of businesses, meeting with residents associations, and doing trainings. I think it was York Region who does, is it annual or every cycle? They meet with all of the incoming city councilors and give the history and the story and speaking points. So then when their constituency offices are called, they actually can answer and respond and be aware. So I think that was a really great comm strategy. Other great comm strategy we saw were, around signage. In Waterloo, they relaxed the signage laws or the signage regulations so that people understood which roads were closed. So this is a bit more practical and nitty gritty, but what was open, what was closed. There were some really interesting opportunities for local festivals who they riffed on the construction themes and embraced it. And we found, the more communities made light of what was going on and the more they embraced it, the better it was for the actual project. So it was interesting how we saw the messages amplified by different voices. And so the more you can get other people telling your story, the better your project's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And to speak maybe a bit more specifically to the involvement of media and social media as well, a really interesting thing that we were able to observe across the 4 different case studies is how different the public dialogue played out when there was strong local media as opposed to when the region relied on sort of more regional media to cover their transportation issues. And so we heard from lots of people that, a really active media scene can be both a blessing and a curse, but we know that overall, the biggest risk to a project is that people don't know about it, because that can result in some surprises down the road. And so we really saw project teams making an effort to work with media to get themselves out there as much as possible. And that was more of a challenge in these communities that couldn't work more closely with local media. And something that we all see now as well is sort of citizen-based media. So there were plenty of citizen-run blogs that started up that do some of the most awesome coverage of some of these projects. So that was a theme that we observed quite a bit as well. I would just say too, on sort of the use of social media and online engagement, we saw a lot of this, and we think that it's really critical as part of sort of an overall participation strategy, but that it isn't a replacement for the kind of in-person conversations that need to happen as part of these projects as well.
So we've gotten a few questions and comments here about the importance of active transportation. So specifically in your research, did you find any cases around other types of active transportation, cycling, walking, that are incorporated in the transit planning process? And not just around stations, but also along corridors. So, bike lanes along transit corridors, things like
that. It's a great question, and it's obviously super important. We didn't document a lot of examples of that, and it may be more because we didn't include active transportation within the scope of our research than the fact that it wasn't happening. So, I mean, we did see in a lot of the urban design guidelines that were supporting the land use planning work, and in some of the new zoning that, for example, there were provisions for bike parking and bike and pedestrian access, but we didn't examine the active transportation side too much in depth. So I wouldn't want to be quoted as saying that we didn't see this in these case study communities, because I'm sure that work is happening as well.
Yeah, and I think we can all agree that it's an important area of focus and should be considered. Yeah. Another question that we have is kind of connected to growth plan and density targets. So do you have any thoughts or insights about how different municipalities determine the best densities around transit stations, and how do they incorporate related infrastructure issues in planning?
Yeah, great question. As I mentioned, we saw a pretty big difference between the three greater Golden Horseshoe communities that we looked at and then the city of Ottawa, just because the city of Ottawa doesn't operate within that growth plan context. And so in their case, they really spent a lot of effort in the city of Ottawa doing calculations, figuring out specifically what kind of density they would need to meet their kind of self-identified targets, and back calculating that to their zoning. Whereas in the GGH, some of that work is kind of out there already. What I would say, though, is that it's never simply an exercise of taking the density target in the plan and applying it in one's local community. And all of the municipalities recognize that they had a lot of local constraints to work with as well. And those things tend to feature strongly in the determination of the heights and densities that were ultimately permitted in the zoning. And so something like a local concern around preservation of character, even just what the infrastructure would support, working on a narrow right-of-way where only certain heights would work, all those kinds of constraints, I would say, were as important as the targets and kind of determining what ultimately the regulations would look like.
Great, thank you. So this is another question around the engagement piece. So do you think walking tours on portions of proposed transit lines can be a good way to do public outreach in addition to, in-person meetings and workshops and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think speaking, connecting this question to the one earlier about fatigue, I think what we saw was people who took, or project leaders who took creative ways to engage the public found that they were able to reach audiences that were often harder to reach. So definitely corridor walks, having special events or festivals around the community plans or the new transit. Again, speaking to the Mississauga example where they just had the LRT in the community at City Hall. I think in Waterloo we also saw a construction tracker website so that people could engage online to understand. So really taking a grassroots approach and meeting people where they were at seemed to resonate really well, and deal both with how to get messages across, how to address fears and discomfort, but also to deal with the fatigue of public engagement.
Okay, so the next question is about, you mentioned the flexible zoning process. So that sounds interesting. The question is there not a danger that it just encourages inertia and NIMBYism?
Yeah, great questions. And just to clarify, that flexible zoning process that I spoke about specifically was in the city of Ottawa. It's a good question. I think, so just to explain a little bit more about how it worked, it was sort of for certain areas of the corridor, and for any vacant property or where a landowner requested it, they were immediately kind of bumped up to the new, they called it TD zoning. So that was the new zoning designation. So then as soon as they would come in for a site plan approval, they would have to meet those higher targets. And then for the landowners that had existing uses, they could develop under their old zoning if they wished, but then if they went over that FSA or that height or density, then the new ones would be triggered right away. So we haven't seen the results of this yet. It's pretty new in Ottawa, and for the last couple of years, they've really been under construction. So they're not anticipating, they're kind of anticipating that the applications will start coming in kind of now and moving forward. I think it would depend on the extent to which the corridor was vacant versus existing properties. And I also think that you know, it doesn't allow a decrease, and there's that trigger system in place where if you go a little bit over, you go right up to the new zoning. So I think we'd be correct in maybe identifying that as a risk, that ultimately nothing would happen, but I think it'll only be borne out sort of in the reality of the applications and development that ends up happening on that corridor.
Okay, so we're about out of time, and I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but I'll speak for Michelle and Lindsay when I say that, you know, we're all glad to keep the conversation going. So feel free to get in touch with Lindsay or Michelle or myself afterwards. You have my email at the start of the presentation. Do you want to just put that slide back up there, Lindsay? And yeah, and then as I mentioned before, we'll be sharing the recording of the presentation and the PowerPoint with everyone early next week. And yeah, and if we didn't get to your questions today, I apologize. And thank you everyone so much for your interest and great questions. Lindsay and Michelle, do you have anything to say before we go? Great. All right, well, thank you so much everyone for spending your lunchtime with us. And we'll hope to speak with you all soon. Thank you.